It is very important for us to stay with the mind. Remain with it. Take care of it. Tend to its needs. Look after the mind. In order to do that successfully, our, our efforts must be undaunting and also geared towards sharpening the mind, making the mind sharp, specifically our awareness of where we are at mentally, verbally, and physically. Where are we at? What's happening? This is a tall order. This is difficult to accomplish. To stay with the mind, tend to its needs, take care of it while maintaining its sharpness. All throughout maintaining Sīla. The world is constantly coming and knocking on our doors, trying to strip us from any sense of mindfulness, any sense of groundedness, even mindfulness, because emotions have such a huge place for us in our existence. Our concepts have such a huge importance. They represent something big for us. In fact, so big that we identify with them. They and us are the same. Our thoughts, our feelings, our memories. Just part and parcel of who we are. So it is no surprise, therefore, for us to be pulled out of the state of mindfulness or consistently trying to maintain awareness. Because relatively, it is the new kid on the block, if you will. It's something new that we're doing to the mind. Compared to lifetimes of habits, habitual patterns, which Lord Buddha called it the kileshas, the three defilements. Craving isn't something that just happens to us or we fall for it. It's a pattern. It's our tendency of living, our experiences, our tendency in experiencing things in a certain way is not the outcome of just a short while. It's been with us for eons. So even a moment's mindfulness, even a tiny little bit of awareness, even a tiny little bit of time where we have spent in metta, it's so powerful that it can really put a dent on lifetimes upon lifetimes of living in delusion. So even though maintaining sati or maintaining Sīla might be something rather novel or new or different in our mind, in our lives, in our practice, nevertheless, it is powerful enough to really change the trajectory of our lives from suffering, from sorrow, and moving it to a state of freedom. Freedom from that sorrow, freedom from that suffering. And the more we practice, the more we get to really enjoy the taste of that freedom. But the mind is always there. Mara is always there to come and dissuade us, to kind of take away the significance of what has been accomplished and is being accomplished by bringing in examples, using memories, using the habits, and saying, you have a long way to go. In fact, might as well just give up and go back to your habits, because that's our home. That's what we're comfortable with. That's what we're used to. So we self-disparage. We get to lose our confidence, our faith in ourselves, in our goodness, in our virtue. Our virtues have to be our anchor. That's why we practice Sīla. Our generosity is something to fall back on in those moments when it's really difficult to maintain our course. Our vigilance sometimes is all we have, because life is coming at us from every single angle imaginable to shake us, to give up, to just relinquish the drive to persevere, to just give up. This is where the mindfulness has to be so sharpened, and we need to always using that whetstone of sharpening our awareness constantly, day in, day out, and not relying on the laurels of yesterday, the conquests of yesterday, the experiences, the joys, the fruits of yesterday, or how great it felt some time ago. Yes, using that as a spark, as a trigger, yes, that's wonderful, but not to dwell there, but to move from there and inhabit this moment, inhabit this present as we push through this inertia, which is another form of saying, another way of saying delusion or ignorance, avidya. Avidya is the greatest state of inertia, is the most powerful state of just being stuck and convincing ourselves that that is the norm, that is the place to be. Throughout the suttas, we see how Lord Buddha, when asked about energy, or specifically about what are the foundations for psychic power, for example, he would always point out the four bases. Sometimes you see him also adding one more. For example, in the Anguttara Nikaya, we see them represented as 5 instead of 4. But the 4 are there. The first of which is desire, chanda. In Buddhism, we don't shun desire. We don't throw the baby with the bathwater, because there's tremendous amount of energy of saturated. It's like loads of great potential within desire itself. Potential. That's why it's called Dhamma chanda. And in this case, in this context, when Lord Buddha is talking about the 4 foundations of, or the 4 bases of psychic power, starting with desire, the desire has to be there to just point us in the right direction. It's like that fanning motion that is necessary to keep the fire burning. Now, holding on to any of these, obviously, is detrimental to the whole process or whatever outcome we are after. But desire is the first. It needs to be there. It's like the 2 pieces of dry wood that Buddha talks about in so many suttas, where you have to create that friction, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, steadily, consistently, with the same intensity, until you see that smoke. Till you see that smoke. But our work is not done. So with desire, the desire is the spark, but the thing that creates, that maintains that friction is the consistent vidya, or persevering energy, or consistent effort. Active effort. And then to allow these 2 to function beautifully, we need to bring in the mind, or the heart. Lord Buddha calls it chitta. We need to infuse it with heart. We need to infuse it with the deliberate desire to really feel all the dimensions of this experience. And the heart also represents trust. Trusting in the goodness of our desire to maintain this course with vidya, so we can actually taste the fruits, which, by the way, are taking place. Because as we are putting in the desire, as we're putting in the vidya, as we're putting in the heart into it, already the mind is experiencing more and more states of, deeper and deeper states of contentment, appeasement, calm, comfort. And then to see what's really going on and how much desire might be lacking, or whether there is enough effort or virya. For that, we need to have the 4th base for psychic power, and that is vimansa, which is the investigation, to look at whether we're on the right trajectory, whether we are on the right path. So these go hand in hand every time we are sitting, every time we're about to sit. For every successful sit, and successful doesn't necessarily mean a sit where there is no hindrances, for example. The hindrances might be there, sometimes in full force. But what are we doing with them? So that can still be a very successful sit, whether we are taking them as ourselves, as we're feeling the agitation in the body, the heat, the heart becoming more and more constricted. That's when we personalized it. So the investigation, the part of it, of the four bases of psychic power, allows us to see, use that observational skill with wisdom to see what's going on. And if we are to add the fifth, as I mentioned earlier, the fifth basis, as mentioned in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha adds consistent zeal to the mix, being enthusiastic about the whole process, looking forward. And even while we're in the midst of this whole process, almost like you're very eager to find out how every single drop of energy, every single drop of desire, every single drop of heart, every single drop of investigation we're putting into this, how it's unfolding. So if we were to take liberty with giving it a term, a single term, a phrase or a word to describe these four or five, I feel comfortable using the word engagement. Fully engaged, being fully engaged in the process. And when we look at sati, when we look at mindfulness, isn't that what it is? Being engaged with awareness, seeing things as they are, as they're taking place, without being grasped, or without grasping, or last week, as we talked about, grabbing onto whatever it is that's taking place. Unfortunately, though, the brain has this tendency of being more like a Velcro than a non-adhesive type of a surface like glass. We're more like Velcro. We're very much like adhesive. And when it comes to experiences, when it comes to memories, when it comes to emotions, thoughts. So sati, when we're fully there with it, when we have sharpened it enough, and we're sharpening it enough all the time, consistently, does have the power to liberate us from just latching on to, grabbing on to things while we are expecting something else to happen. And this is how I understand suffering in a more relatable way, in a way we can understand it given our lives and our experiences, and specifically in the context of our practice. So how we carry the mind, how we tend to it, how we hold on to it, how we take care of it, has has everything to do with sati. and sharpening it, staying with it, not for an hour a day, not for 2 hours a week, etc. But to stay with it as often as humanly possible. And for this reason, Lord Buddha brought in the mental aspect of maintaining our Sīla, our virtuous behavior, our ethics, if you will, our morality. Because somehow we humans have a tendency to think that Sīla starts and ends with physical action, or maybe sometimes verbal action, speech. But Sīla, the breaking of Sīla rather, does not take place there. It doesn't start with our mouth, the words that are coming out, or the physical actions that are unwholesome. But they first start in the mind. That's where the dam breaks, in the mind. For that reason, Lord Buddha insisted. We have so many discourses, and the one that I'm thinking of having us do next week, I think it's Majjhima Nikaya 56. It's a very long sutta. It's called Upali Sutta, where he clearly delineates the difference between the Dhamma that Lord Buddha was teaching and other teachings available at that time. And primarily in this sutta, we see the emphasis of the mind, maintaining mental Sīla. So I'm bringing this in here so that we can start seeing the connection between the two, sati and maintaining mental Sīla, being virtuous in our thoughts. Because they rub off of each other, they help each other. Because the mind is going to say, hey, what is that thought? Well, why are we thinking that? Is that wholesome or unwholesome? Just a question. Well, no one can hear it, no one can know about it except for me. So this is where we take away that carte blanche, that license from our hands, our own hands, that it's okay for me to think unwholesome thoughts, either to myself, for myself, or about others. So that's where it has to stop, first of all. And the more of a communication goes on between sati and mental virtuous behavior, the more there is this understanding of, you know what, I'm not agitated as much as I would be this time of the day or year or whatever. Something that we do not necessarily think about a lot is that when we are not mindful, we are breaking the precept of mental virtues. When we're not mindful. Because Sīla has many, many layers to it. There's so many subtle layers to it. Sīla is not encapsulated just in the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts or 227. It's not just that. That's just a superficial layer. That's for Putujjanas, common, ordinary, average beings, which again are necessary, of course. We have to start somewhere. But as we practice, the understanding, the experience of Sīla goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, because the person starts to see that if there isn't that state of contentment In other words, there is that inner state of agitation. The mind starts to see the correlation of that with a breaking of a precept, which creates what? That same state to begin with. And then it gets worse and worse and worse because remorse kicks in. Restlessness becomes more louder and louder and louder the more we avoid addressing it. That's why most people are caught in that downward spiral, cyclical. They can't get out of, almost like an addict. They do the thing, they regret it, they feel so much remorse that they only end up perpetuating that cycle. So as we're practicing sharpening our awareness by staying with the mind more and more and more and more throughout the day, despite the circumstances, the more we become able to see when our awareness falls into a ditch, demonstrated by, as evidenced by, our propensity, our tendency to break mental precepts, meaning the presence of the three defilements in our thoughts. Am I leaning too much into this thing that I want to experience? Tasting this thing, hearing this thing, seeing that thing, wanting this, or hating this, or just dragging ourselves or pulling ourselves and dumping ourselves into the mire of indifference, forgetfulness, just going and taking a long, long nap so we can just like avoid all of this. So this takes responsibility from us. It requires it, in fact. It's indispensable. So is this doable? Of course it is. You're here every week, after all. So we see different sets of data coming in, different sorts of evidence that touches us deeply. And that's what we need. That's all we need to create that spark. In the book of the sixes, in Anguttara Nikaya, Lord Buddha talks about 6 qualities that must be relinquished in order for a person, for an anagami, in fact, to become an arahant. They have to do with, primarily they have to do with the sangyojanas, or the fetters. But the first 2 are sloth and torpor, sleepiness, drowsiness, disinterest, lack of interest, etc. The other 2 have to do with restlessness and worry, remorse, constantly dwelling on the past, regretfully, this and that. And then he points out the other 2, the last 2 of the 6. He says, lack of faith and heedlessness. Lack of faith. I've always wondered about that. Lack of faith. Who? Faith in the Buddha? Faith in what? If I'm not connected with my sati enough, if I don't allow myself to go deeper and deeper into experiencing more and more subtle states of mind through contentment, through non-agitation, those states that reveal themselves, then I won't be able to see myself in a better light, as it were. See the potentials that are waiting, that if I pursue this path in this way, hey, who put this effort into this? Well, the person did. I did. Okay. So let me go ahead digging some more. Let me dig some more. Let me dig some more. You see that part that I mentioned about consistent enthusiasm, zeal? That can also be referred to as the faith, looking forward to experiencing, making room in my mind that there could be a potentially a bigger vista of experience for me here. So it has to start that lack of faith to create an antidote for that, to overcome that. We need to drop back into ourselves. And hence, either you use your dana, your generosity, and be happy about that. Feel good about the fact that you've been generous with something, someone. You gave something that you consider to be valuable to someone who's in need. Or virtue. You really pulled yourself up through your bootstraps and really did what didn't come easy, but then the outcome was amazing because you're in a virtuous state. Your mind is calm, which is the litmus test of you doing a successful Sīla lifestyle. So you don't have to go far to understand or grab the juiciness of, and I use grab here, not the way that I use for kileshas, of course, but to really soak into that sense of, oh, faith comes up. That is one of the requirements for becoming an arahant, the Lord Buddha says. You're a virtue. Now, for some people, just recalling the characteristics of the triple gem, the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, is enough. But for some others, that might be like a third person or the other versus the virtue that you have within you, you live by. That might really hit home for you to generate that sense of faith, enthusiasm within you. And of course, the sixth one is lack of vigilance or lack of heedfulness, basically heedlessness, which goes against maintaining sati throughout. So having this approach, as we're looking at things like anicca, for example, the impermanent nature, the inconstancy of experience, of phenomena, allows us to pull back a little and not become so heated, so hot, so agitated, which Lord Buddha calls it viraga. No longer passionate, or dispassion comes in. Because we're creating these buffers. Seeing anicca. Okay, so what's the point in me holding on to this? Ultimately, it's going to change anyhow. It's going to fade away. What's the point? Whether it's my body, my relationship, my relationships, things I like, etc. And as viraga comes in and it dominates your mind, your experience, suddenly you feel yourself no longer caught in the trap. And that's why Lord Buddha calls it nirodha, cessation, the ending, the end. And because of that, there is the giving up. That naturally you see the whole pointlessness of the whole thing. Why should I hold on to this? Because it's going to change anyhow. Why should I get agitated over this? Because it's changing. And because I'm pulling away, there's cessation. And because of the repeatability of this whole process, then the giving up becomes a lot more easy or easier. And that's another word for nekkhamma, or renunciation, or relinquishment, or giving up, which is patinisagga. Now, of course, this, if somebody who's unfamiliar with the Dhamma or Buddhism might look at this and say, oh, you're teaching me to be an inanimate object, someone without feeling or anything. And this comes from wrong view, because the person equates life, in fact, equates suffering and feeling as the same thing. It comes with the territory, so it's fine. And so there's the identification of feelings as this is me, this is mine, this is who I am. No, the Dhamma says no. You can have feelings, but you don't have to take that extra step where you're leaning into the feeling itself. And that is where the cessation lies. Because if you remember from last week's Madhupindika Sutta, so long as there's a functioning eye, there's an object to be seen. Because of these two coming together, there is the visual eye awareness. And because of that, because of these things, three of them, there takes place contact. So long as you have these. And because of contact, the natural result is the taking place of feeling. Everything is fine up to this point. The Dhamma says it's perfect. Don't take anything else. Don't try to throw a bucket of plaster on it and try to crystallize it so that you can take it home with you. That's the problem of the Putujjana, the common, ordinary, average being who likes to frame things, like those people who frame butterflies, picking up beautiful butterflies and sticking a needle through the body and sticking it on a platform and covering up with a glass cover so they can maintain the beauty of the butterfly. So playing with these, taking these, trying to digest these principles is part of keeping the Dhamma alive. And most importantly, not just keeping it alive, but in the process also changing the very spiritual DNA that we have, allowing the character change to take place, the transformation. And that's why we do this. We don't just do this to get 1 hour of relaxation or rest. So let's maintain that. Let's bring that sense of sharpening of the mind constantly with us wherever we go, whatever we do, but without relinquishing the important role of watching over the quality, the wholesome quality of our thoughts, because that's where everything begins. So I will pause here and ask for if there's any questions, thoughts, comments, critiques. In therapy, most therapists at one point or another are terrified from these moments. Silence. They want to infuse a word or two. We want to fill these gaps. Perhaps it's a natural human tendency, but there's so much. And it's valuable, at least for us, each of us, if we can not necessarily just ponder what was shared with you just now, but also, even more important is to look at your own thoughts in response, or whatever is taking place in the mind. One of my teachers from the past used to say how in long retreats, the first few days or a week, you're doing noble silence, you're not speaking with each other. But then he would slowly allow people to engage a little bit with a little bit of conversation here and there. And then he would insist that the people who are speaking, wish to speak, they never pay attention to what the other person is saying. He would encourage that. Instead, to look at what is taking place in the mind, because that's where the kileshas or the defilements are really having like an Olympic match, if you will. So much going on. So if we can use these silences also to check, take care of the mind by looking at, that'll be wonderful as well. It's like a continuation of your meditation practice. Nevertheless, if there are any other questions, or any questions, otherwise we can cut it short today.
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
I'll ask the question. In terms of looking at myself, I'm just so far from where you are encouraging us to be constantly mindful, to be able to not to allow worldly things to distract us from the important path. But I'm thinking also of what you said about generosity. In other words, how do you use Sīla to help you on this path? And do you feel that sometimes there is a conflict because generosity often involves, going out of one's way to help another person? And that takes time from you concentrating on yourself. I mean, even cooking a meal for someone, so I just want you to tell me, how do you kind of negotiate sometimes, even in the attempt to be generous to help someone else, for instance, does take time from being focused, being mindful at all time, when you are answering other people's calls to do things.
Perhaps I didn't understand you correctly, but initially you were saying about Sīla and generosity, whether there's a conflict. And then what I heard you say was that when you are being generous, it means that you're going to go out of your zone, in a sense, of whatever you've established for yourself, whether it's mindfulness or whatever. First, before I attempt to answer your question, is what I understood correct?
Right, because sometimes generosity does involve being empathetic with another person. So you would try to do what another person wants, for instance, and that sometimes, distract you from kind of constantly staying focused on just being mindful of what you are doing. At least I myself feel a conflict. Maybe that shouldn't be a conflict, but I feel that sometimes.
Your hunch is correct, because there needn't be any conflict there. because it's just an extension of oneself. After all, just like meditating or being mindful for, let's say, 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 5 hours, it's not just for that purpose only. It's training that we're engaged in so that we can extend it and allow it to spread out. It's like a tablecloth that is sufficient enough to cover a whole table, no matter how big. But what we've done is we've folded it up over each other. So you have a stack of what looks like maybe 1 square foot of coverage of the table. So from the top, you look at it and it's like it's barely covering a tiny little portion of the table, but it is a tablecloth. So what meditation allows us to do is to open it up, unfold it, and stretch it out. Allow it to be beautifully spread all across your life in every dimensions. And what really is interesting is as we are engaging in generosity, something beautiful happens. Actually, many beautiful things happen, but in the action of giving from one with our thoughts and our intention, and whatever this valuable thing is, it doesn't have to have an actual monetary value that much. Basically, it could be something that is intangible in that fashion, but nevertheless, something that is needed for another person. As we're doing this, as we're engaged in this with a mind that is calm, without having any agendas attached to the act itself, your mindfulness suddenly becomes truly manifold. What I mean by that, you tap into part of your mind that you never knew existed. I was mentioning this to another student the other day. Imagine somebody gave you the keys to a vast castle with countless rooms, and I mean countless. And there's nothing terrifying about it. There's nothing worrisome about it. And there's lighting everywhere. And you're the only person, and they give you the key, and you don't know what's in each room. But with mindfulness, as you're practicing, suddenly all these vast recesses of the castle become available to you. However, many of us are just content, happy, with just maybe a single room or even a portion of a room. Maybe the castle has at least 500 rooms. But we just say, oh, I got this, so we don't, that's fine. Probably everything else, every other room is a carbon copy of this. That's why we become stagnant in our lives, in our thinking, in our feeling. So generosity is one of the best ways to experience the vastness of your mind, if you're going about it the right way. So it is not taking away anything from your mindfulness as you engage in a generous act, for example. Similarly with Sīla. When you are practicing Sīla, when you are practicing virtue, when you're not breaking a precept, that automatically entails that you are present with mindfulness there. They come hand in hand. Now, as you go deeper into the practice of Sīla, where it's no longer just show-offy, where it's no longer for other people to see that, hey, look at me. When you penetrate that shield of, nonsense, when you go beyond that, you start tasting the beauty of that is Sīla. That's when you're going into Adi Sīla, or the higher virtuous living, where you take Sīla with you wherever you go. You take it everywhere because your heart functions with Sīla. That is its filter. You cannot do anything that is going to cause you harm, because anything that's going to cause you harm is also going to cause someone else harm, or the environment harm. So you start seeing this clearly. So I would invite you not to look at mindfulness or meditation or what we gain from it as something independent or separate from any of these other virtuous acts, whether it's Sīla, whether it's generosity, whether it's sharing of metta, because they're part of the whole beautiful, tasty meal, if you will. So I hope that addresses your question.
So what if, say, when one is sitting and then a neighbor call and say, I need help. So that's what I think I meant by conflict. Sometimes is it important to really focus on the meditation when you're meditating, when there's like someone saying that I really need help right now, and then do I drop everything and help the person, or should I say, I'm doing something more important right now? So that's what I meant, on a daily basis, sometimes you do have these conflicting moments.
Discernment has to be there all throughout, because that, there's so many questions I would ask given that scenario. Whether this person constantly calls you, whether this person is codependent on you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or this is out of the blue and this is out of character. Basically, something definitely is urgent there, and you know this for sure. Let's say, and for some reason you have also left your phone you didn't turn off your phone, which is something that I highly recommend. Mute it or something, turn it off when you're meditating. But let's say all these criteria are there and the person genuinely needs help, and you're in the position of providing them some form of a help to them, to help them in this situation. You do just that when you know you're capable of doing it. Because what kind of a sit is that really going to be like if you say, yeah, but no, I still have about 30 more minutes to go. Sorry, buddy. What? How are you going to really have a non-agitated mind at that point? And if you do, which it would not be, by the way, it would just be self-centeredness, indifference, and the total opposite of metta, having no sense of discernment or wisdom, completely diametrically opposite to what the Dhamma is. I mean, you have this kind of traditions all over the place. You have it also in the Dhamma, by the way, in the Buddhist traditions. Some places you've seen this. We see this. But there needs to be discernment, as I said, the first thing, to identify these factors and to check in with yourself, right? So ultimately, it's all about connection. And I remember this article I read about the famed anthropologist from the 20th century, Margaret Mead, when she was asked about when did human beings become civilized? What does science say? What does the science of anthropology tell us as to where civilization took place? And she points to her femur bone in her leg and she says, when the femur bone of a human being was broken. And the interviewer just goes, you're like, what? Tell me more. What is this? Like, are you joking? And she says, we've discovered that, well, let me just take a step back. A femur is, the femur bone is the longest bone in the body, the human body. Now, they say that if you break the femur, the bone, which also makes plenty of red blood cells, if you break that, they say that it is far worse than natural childbirth. They've done the research. I didn't do it. It's far worse in pain. Now, the problem with a broken femur is that once a person's femur breaks, that person can no longer go on their journey, go on their hunt, go down the stream to get some water. Basically, they drop down and die. They're just waiting for death, which, interestingly enough, necessitates that other human beings come for help. They carry that person. They tend to their wounds. They take care of them. They feed them. Hence, her mentioning of civilization beginning at the moment where a human femur bone was broken. To me, that's like very, very poignant, and it goes beautifully in sync with the practice of metta or being generous, because generosity also has within it metta, the higher form of generosity. Of course, many people across the centuries, across cultures, have wanted to give something, but always having that subtle wish in the background. Because almost every single religious tradition has well, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And there's a lot of great truth to that, yes. If not in this life, in other lives, of course. But that's still like cheap. That's almost like business transaction. If you're coming from a metta place, a place in your heart, no, this person needs me. They just broken a femur. They're calling me because something terrible happened. Now, it's very important to have you go through the helping process, being generous with your time, getting up, dressing up if you weren't dressed up properly, taking off and going and helping, maybe picking them up, taking them to the hospital or whatever. But it's very crucial for you to have your mind be under watch, not to lose it. And this is the reason why I was saying earlier that it's like the wide, in fact, limitless stretch of a tablecloth. That's what mindfulness is, can be. And it's ready to be stretched out in every aspect, into every aspect, every single nook and cranny of your life. So there is not a place, to sum it up, there is not a place in your whole entire existence where sati or metta or generosity or sīla cannot fit into and beautify.
Thank you.
Great question. Yes.
Bhante, if I may, I'd like to add my personal outlook on everything that you just said. For KK, when I hear that situation, and I'm not saying that I do this myself, it's a practice, but any interruption, especially to help somebody, is something we should be really excited to do and to look forward to those interruptions, because what we do on the cushion is a practice for what we do in our lives out there. So when whether we're on the cushion or whether we're helping the neighbor or the friend who needs some help, shouldn't be any different. We're still practicing metta. We're still practicing compassion, we're still practicing joy, and we're still practicing equanimity. And so when we get that call for help, the excitement should come where we can put into action the thing that we've been practicing. So these interruptions aren't an end to our practice. They're the beginning of the result.
Lovely. Perfect. I don't have anything to add to that. It's just perfect. If I may just, oftentimes we think that it's a solitary affair. Yes, big chunk of our work is. We're tuning in, we're honing in, we're working on ourselves. But working for what? Training for what? Life shouldn't be just about training and training and training and training and training, and then you're dead. Training and execution of whatever we were training for. Oftentimes today, in this very fast-paced society, world that we're living in, where we're surrounded by literally unknowns at every corner, require us to put into to actually live out what we were training for, to do it. And because I've seen way too many times where it's all about the retreat, it's all about the goodies that we get from a retreat, from a sit, totally disconnected from the world around us. And I've shared a few times in the past, so I don't want to share again the incidents, some of the incidents I've seen where practitioners, so-called advanced practitioners, I was a witness to, where I was shocked at the lack of humanity. So the Dhamma proper has nothing to do with such an affair. And that's why what Greg is saying also is it's all about the practice. And that enthusiasm that comes, that zeal, oh my God, I'm going to help somebody. Someone needs my help. Yes, Upatissa, you have something to say?
Thanks very much for the talk, Bhante. If I may add something, the way I understand the Dhamma is that it's not about staying immobile for 5 hours or for until the bell rings. Okay, it's more about maintaining samadhi or the right perspective, and which brings me to the example of Mahakassapa, who has been shortlisted by the Buddha, for his Dhutanga practices, ascetic practices. We know from the suttas that Mahakassapa is not a sociable person. He loves to spend time in the forest all by himself. So much so that the Buddha had to go to the forest and look for him and say, look, if you don't like to socialize with your friends, that's not a problem. That's perfectly okay. You are Arahant. But please come back to the monastery, okay, at least on Upasada days, to recite the Patimokkha, because your very presence would be an inspiration to future generations, to your friends who has not attained to arahantship. And if we recall what happens during the Buddha's parinibbana, okay, during that time the chief disciples have already passed away, and Mahakassapa was the most senior member of the Sangha left. And it was Mahakassapa who presided over the first council that gave us the teachings 2,600 years later.
Yes. Thank you for bringing Venerable Mahakassapa into this discussion. Upatissa. Absolutely. And he was one of the most loving teachers as well. He didn't just stay alone. Of course, he also had his own group of students. One time, Venerable Lord Buddha was in, I believe it was at the Vulture's Peak in Rajgir, And there's a lovely sutta where I forgot which one it was, but basically Lord Buddha is turning around and he's looking and he sees with his mind each of his chief disciples plus these great senior disciples, arahants, with their close-knit circle of bhikkhus, students. And you can almost feel the joy, the contentment in Lord Buddha's heart as he was observing, as being their teacher, looking at how each of his students were taking such loving care of their students, their individual respective students. And then Lord Buddha says how each of these teachers, in turn, had attracted their type of students that have the same type of disposition or aptitude or inclination. So Venerable Mahakassapa was training and teaching the bhikkhus that were very much into dhuttangas and ascetic practices. So they really looked for that seclusion. Venerable Anuruddha was working with students who were ready and eager to go into experiencing the Dibba Chakku, divine eye. Venerable Sariputta was in wisdom. Mahakassapa, Mahamoggalana was with those students who had the ability or desire to go deeper in their psychic abilities, developing their understanding of the Dhamma meanwhile. So there's so much sharing that was going on. And with your permission, Upatissa, I'm going to go ahead and add something as to what happened for Venerable Mahakassapa to convene, to organize the first council. See, Venerable Mahakassapa was not there when Lord Buddha died. He was far away with his own group of students. And as well, one sadhu is approaching. A sadhu is an ascetic of a different sect, but he's holding a certain type of a flower. I think it was udumbara, something like that. Well, basically a flower that doesn't grow on this planet. It's a celestial flower, they say. And immediately Venerable Mahakassapa realizes what has happened. And the person gives homage to Venerable Mahakassapa, and he takes off and he says, your teacher has died. And some of the monks that were sitting there, specifically one particular monk who had joined recently in his life, the order, an older, much older bhikkhu, in hearing that Lord Buddha had died, becomes very jubilant. And he starts getting also upset at his fellow other students, other bhikkhus, and says, why are you guys so mad? Why are you so upset? The old man, this is what he says, the old man, quoting him, is finally dead. No one's going to be bossing us around about Sīla, keeping this precept, that precept. Now we can do whatever we want. Now look at Venerable Mahakassapa's humility and astuteness. He doesn't say a word, he doesn't scold, he doesn't admonish that old bhikkhu. He says, we're moving towards Kushinada, where they were getting ready to cremate the body. So he gets there and then organizes it, and basically he sees in that moment how the Dhamma doesn't have much life left unless they could codify, they could organize the teachings, put them in order. And that's how we ended up getting the first council, because of the significant fortitude and foresight, rather, of Venerable Mahakassapa in organizing this, where he gathered 500 arahants, including Venerable Ananda. That's how we get the Nikayas today. That's how we get the Vinaya, the majority of which, except for the Khuddaka Nikaya, some portions of it were added later. That's how we have that. And this comes from a bhikkhu who was very much, as Upatissa was saying, into living the solitary life. So using it wisely as it is needed. So wonderful contribution, guys. Appreciate that. I really am happy with your questions and your involvement and your love for the Dhamma. It's beautiful. Any other thoughts? Very well. Let's share some merits. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share in these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sad, sad, sad. May the Triple Gem bless you, protect you and your loved ones. Keep the doors of your heart open. That's where the Dhamma lies. That's where it is. That's where the deathless is. But for now, that's where also the kileshas are. Let's practice to peel them away. Be well. I'll see you next week.